Dear TB, something is haunting the woods of Mount Shasta, California. I don't know what it is, but I think I've seen it twice. Now, before I moved to Mount Shasta, I'd heard all the strange stories about this area, including weird disappearances, underground alien bases, and UFO sightings, but I really didn't take them very seriously. I was living in the suburbs, which was as far away from anything strange as somebody could possibly get. It's just not something you go around thinking about all the time. I had lived in Mount Shasta for a few years before I really saw anything like the kinds of stories that people tell around here. Almost everyone you meet will talk about something they've seen after you get to know them. A couple of miles from town is Lake Siskiyou. There's many miles of trails and shoreline to hike along and swim, surrounded by hills and forests. I hope that what I'm about to admit doesn't make me sound less credible, but I've used marijuana occasionally since high school, and at the time this happened, I was using it medicinally to help with some medical issues. It's legal in California and not really a big deal. Most people are okay about it. Well, to make a long story short, I wanted to try and grow a few plants on my own. So I bought some seedlings, and I went searching around in a few areas of the forest in the back of Lake Siskiyou, where a series of creeks flow into it. I was trying to find a place near a water source where I could plant some seeds that had a lot of shrubbery and tree cover, so the plants could be hidden. Now, this wasn't a big operation. I just wanted a couple plants for my own use. We were renting a place at the time, and I didn't have any property to grow on, so it seemed like a pretty harmless thing to do. You can understand it's partly because of this that I'm being very careful about remaining unknown. Technically, I could get into some trouble for this. Well, it was getting near the end of summer when a friend and I had camped out in the woods behind that lake. Before dark, we took the trail to the north shore and walked up into the forest where we had set up a tent in a wooded area close to where my plants were growing. We were trying to be quiet and didn't use any lights because, it's illegal to camp there overnight. It was around midnight when we decided to go to the lake's north shore for a swim because, it was too hot to fall asleep. We were walking along the trail back to the lake. It was dark and very humid. As we continued down the path, we passed through a grassy area, and there was this mist hanging over the area, at about 3 or 4 feet up off the ground. But just in this one area, and nowhere else. I remember my friend saying something about it because, it just seemed so unusual to her. A little further up ahead, something crashed high up in the trees above us. We were both startled by the sound of branches splitting and breaking. And whatever it was made quite a bit of noise, like something was scrambling to hide. This scared the hell out of us both. When I turned and looked around and then looked up, I could see 2 large glowing eyes looking down at us, yellow, from high up in that tree. But the rest of its form was hidden in the branches. It only looked down for a moment, and then must have turned away because its shining eyes were gone a moment later. And then there was another crashing in the limbs, like something suddenly jumping or falling, breaking more branches, but nothing ever hit the ground. My friend wasn't looking up when this happened. She was looking behind us, but she heard it and then turned around. Just as the second crash happened, the tree limbs, way up high, shook, causing broken branches and limbs to fall all around us, but nothing large like an animal ever hit the ground, only the falling debris. It freaked us both out, so we ran and got out of there. After we were further down the trail, I told her that it could have been a bear or maybe a mountain lion climbing up that tree. We must have scared it. But I just couldn't forget how large its eyes must have been. For me to be able to see them shining so brightly from high up in that tree, and the weird mist was only in that grassy area. The whole thing just really bothered me, but I didn't say anything more about it because, well, I didn't want to freak her out for the rest of the night. It was probably about an hour later, after we went swimming on the North Shore, that we saw something again. We were both sitting there on the sand having a smoke, and from behind us, we both heard a sound like huge wings flapping. We turned around at the same time, and we see this large, black, bat-like form soaring directly over us, flying at about the same height as the tallest trees. We watched it as it crossed over the lake and then veered off towards the south, where it disappeared from our view. Now this creature, well, it looked like a flying humanoid with bat-like wings, about the size of a tall man. It was far too big to be any kind of owl or bird, and we were both so freaked out that we didn't go back into the woods again that night. We just headed back to the main campground, adjacent to the lake, got into our car, and drove home. I returned the next day with a friend to get our tent that we had left. My girlfriend, who was there with me the night before, didn't want to go back there. I looked around the area to see if there were any tracks or something. I remember that someone had told me a long time ago that there were reports in the local newspaper about three-toed tracks up on Mount Shasta, but I couldn't find anything. Anything that looked out of the ordinary anyway, and I've never seen anything like that since. But we don't go camping out in remote places around that mountain anymore. I never knew how widespread the sightings of these flying creatures were until after it happened to me, and I started researching it online. And that's how I found out that there's some truth to the strange things that people claim to see around Mount Shasta. Thanks for reading. Signed, Anonymous. Hey there, biker. Now, my two buddies and I, well, let's just call them AJ and PJ here, decided to go late night fishing, have some food, and just enjoy ourselves. We drove up to Holland, Michigan, late at night around 3 to 4 a.m., and we got to the place around 5:30 a.m., where we all got set up under the bridge. Everything was going normal until we moved spots over to the boat launch. Now, just as we were casting out, catching some smallies and seaweed, PJ was suddenly caught on something big, or so we thought until he pulled it out. Well, the thing that PJ pulled out looked like a dirty, old hospital gown. We all got confused and a bit weirded out, so we decided to cut it off the hook instead of touching it. The first thing I noticed was that it started to drift towards the land instead of sinking, but at the time I just shrugged it off. Everything still seemed normal until I turned around to put a bait on my hook, when I looked up and I saw an abnormally tall, white, lanky figure that seemed to have a pointy head with only eyes staring right at me. I thought I was just hallucinating because, well, it was early in the morning and I was so tired. So I looked back to make sure, and the next thing I saw was him standing. Then I felt chills down my spine because I looked below it, and I saw that gown we had cut off the hook. I tried to ignore it because I thought it was just a resident about to tell us off, but the next thing I hear is PJ saying, "Don't freak out, but I think someone's watching us." At that point, I knew what he was talking about. We all started packing up quickly. We got the hell out of there. Now, on the drive home, PJ explained to us what he saw. What he said was the same thing that I'd seen, but it was him walking towards us. I tried doing some research when I got back, but I just ended up in a dead end, with only one news from a man drowning at that boat launch back in 2016. The place we were at is called Petty's Bayou Boat Launch, and that night was probably the scariest night that I've ever experienced. If you can figure out what we saw, well, it would be highly appreciated. Thanks. Signed, Cameron. Hi, biker. I'm Luke B. from Western Kentucky. Now, I gotta admit, this is a weird one, and I've put this experience on the back burner for far too long. I've wanted to get this off my chest for years. It's something that happened in my backyard several years ago. So here's what went down. Well, it was the summer of 2019 when my wife and I had just purchased a new home in a great neighborhood. Now, our house is located in the very back, so where my backyard ends, the forest begins. There's plenty of room for a decent garden and a space for the kids to have a nice place to play. Fast forward just a bit, and I've got a quite nice little selection of veggies growing out back. Mostly just squash, tomatoes, and peppers. And in the very back, well, there was a perfect little cabbage patch. Behind those cabbages was a creek, and then just woods for many miles. So the night that's got me scratching my head happened late in the evening or early morning. It had to have been around 1:30 a.m. I had just finished watching TV and I needed to drain the main vein before I tucked in for bed. Now the window in my back bathroom faces the backyard. If the blinds are open, then you've got a full view of the garden and woods. Well, as I was finishing up, I happened to glance out into the darkness. I forgot to mention that there's a kind of floodlight on a telephone pole in the corner of the yard, so the area where the cabbages are located is somewhat illuminated. You can't make out colors per se, but the silhouettes and outlines are very visible. Now, I've seen a lot of different critters messing around out there. Deer, cats, dogs, raccoons, possums, that sort of thing, but, well, what I saw that night, I still can't explain. The first thing that caught my attention was the movement behind the tomatoes near that cabbage patch. That particular spot wasn't very illuminated, but I could just make out the silhouette of something, about 2 to 3 feet tall, moving up and down in one spot for around 10 seconds, before shifting over a few feet and repeating that same motion, moving up and down. As I got closer and closer to the brighter spot, I started to discern what it was that I was seeing. I had to rub my eyes a few times and squinted to try and clear my vision, but the image never changed. What I saw was what looked to be just a head and torso. The head and torso of a humanoid-type being that looked to be about halfway buried from the waist down, but then it moved. So it definitely wasn't a half-buried person. There were no visible legs. It was just like half of the body was missing. The legs were gone. This thing was using its hands like feet to get around. When it made it just inside the band of light, I could see what I thought I was seeing was correct. A torso, using its arms and hands to move. Now this thing was hairless, but not pale, and its head looked to be very misshapen. Its arms were very thick, and I could make out the size when the light would shine through the space between the arm and the torso. And then, purely by accident, I had my face too close to the screen on the open window, and it made this popping sound. It turned and it looked right at me. I couldn't move. I was just frozen there in place and didn't know what to do. I had never been in a situation like that before. So after a few minutes, which honestly felt much longer, I yelled out, "Hey!" Now it didn't seem to faze this thing at first, but then, with surprising speed, it darted towards me, stopping near in the middle of the yard. And then all of a sudden it screamed, this rough, almost metallic-sounding scream. like some kind of broken, robotic screech owl. And then it took back off to the area where it had been when I first noticed it. There it grabbed something off the ground and then took off through the creek, dragging whatever it was behind it. You could hear the splashes as it went through, and then sticks cracking as it started up through the woods. Well, I just couldn't believe what I'd just seen, and I wanted to go outside with a flashlight and investigate, but to be honest, I was spooked. What did I just see? One of the things that came to mind was the movie Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. That particular scene where Eddie was pretending to be a war veteran who had lost his legs and moved around on a cart. Could a homeless person with no legs be camping out in the woods and then creeping around people's backyards? Well, to me, this seems highly doubtful. Plus, it doesn't explain the odd-shaped head and that terrible scream. I've never even heard of anything like it. Well, that morning, when the sun came out, I went out to the backyard to investigate, and everything was fine until I got to the cabbages. They were all gone except for one. And then I thought back to the way that thing was moving up and down, and then moving over and repeating the process. It was somehow digging up my cabbages. To this day, biker, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever experienced. Thanks for letting me share. Greetings, biker. Now, the incident I'm about to relate happened some 50 years ago. I was visiting my grandparents, who lived in an old farmhouse in central Pennsylvania. My cousin Dee, 1 year younger than me, was there as well, and we rose super early each morning, as was the practice when visiting there. Now, at Grandma's, those who didn't get out of the house before breakfast got a chore list that would take all morning. So Dave and I were determined to avoid that list. Their house stood on top of a hill and was some distance from the road, with a long drive leading up to the car parking area. The ground on either side of that driveway could best be classified as untended meadow, with clumps of trees sporadically scattered throughout. From the car park in front of the house, you look down and out toward the road some 500 yards away. This is where Dee and I had stood that morning. There was a small stand of pine trees about halfway down the hill. Now, these were young trees, not more than 9 feet tall. We knew these trees very well, as they were the impediment to every hill roll or sled run we had ever attempted down that slope. Today, however, we never even got to start the downhill fun. "What the hell is that?" Dee asked. "Beats the hell out of me," I answered. And there, under the nearest pine tree, there was a figure. It appeared to be made out of a golden metal, which glittered in the sunlight. It was about 3 feet tall, as best as we could determine from our uphill angle. From the shoulders down, it seemed to be wrapped or swaddled in golden cloth as well. This extended the entire length of the creature, making it look like it was form-fitted, like a sleeping bag. On its head was a helmet or a headdress, also made of gold. When we first saw it, it was facing to our left, so we were looking at its golden left profile. The sight of this thing made us both freeze in place. We were barely breathing. Now, we stared down at it for a time-distorted period, a minute maybe, and that's when suddenly the thing changed its head. Now, I say it like that because it didn't turn its head. It had been looking straight ahead, at a spot somewhere off to our left, and then suddenly it was looking directly at us. The head didn't move through all the intermediate positions. The transformation was instant. But then, suddenly a wave of dread and terror rolled over the two of us. Now, I have never before or since felt anything so intensely alien and malignant. This thing, whatever it was, it hated us. Now, neither of us was the most athletic of kids, but I beat Dave over the fence by a good 4 feet. Apparently, we burst into the kitchen, babbling incoherently about a golden boy down on the hill. It took us a good half hour to convince Grandpa that there was really something worth seeing if he went out with us. And by that time, of course, there wasn't. Nothing on the ground and nothing near the tree, but that image of a golden boy with his nastiness and his gaze. That memory will never leave me. I use the term golden boy as that's how the family story has evolved since then, but it wasn't a boy. It was humanoid, as best as the distance would reveal, but that sense of malice and dread made it impossible to stick around for more detail. I was around 9 or 10 at the time, and in the 50 years since, I've never heard or read of a similar encounter. Has the golden boy ever crossed your path? Now, I've seen this place since then, and there have been a few changes. My grandparents had only rented there, and I have no idea who owns the property now. But I wonder if they took down that fence because scared kids fell over it too often. P.S. I love the channel and the work you do. Thank you. Signed, Martin.